So I'd like to welcome Tania Barham. She's an associate professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I think we're all a little jealous of the view she probably has every morning.
It's true. It's very nice.
She works in a mixture of development, health, and environmental economics across quite a wide variety of different areas, including cash transfers, household bargaining, the long-run effects of family planning, among others. Also an impressive array of different geographic locations. I think Nicaragua, Mexico, Yemen, Bangladesh, Brazil. I'm sure there are more on that list that I've missed. So please give her a warm welcome. We're excited to have her here today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I was just saying how nice this building is. So, we have very nice views and very old buildings. And with climate change and no air conditioning, it's getting really hot in my office. So, I have to go out and enjoy the view more. So today I would like to talk about what feels like some long-term research, which is looking at the long-term effects of a project that we started in Bangladesh. We didn't start the project started in the 70s, but we started data collection around 2012. So this is collection that was supported by the NIH, 3IB, and PRB, and the CU Population Center. We were doing this in the mid-2000s, and we kept getting cut. So we kept getting more sources to come out. And it's called No Place Like Home, the long-run impacts of early childhood health and family planning on economic and migration outcomes. And kind of what motivated me to think about this project was this idea that people really think that if you improve early life circumstances, hopefully, that's going to pull them out of poverty and maybe into better labor market outcomes. And there's lots of policies that kind of depend on this, including what many development economists look at and what I look at, which are conditional cash transfers. But when you begin to look at that data, it's just not there, right? So some of this has done structural models that kind of look at this, but really there hasn't been kind of a nice intervention where you can look 35 or 20 years later to see what happens when you improve early childhood health. So I was really interested in what this link was, and we kind of realized why you're in a developing country, that's great that you improve early childhood health, but there's lots of other things that go along in people's lives and lots of shocks that they have, right? And there can be just fade out of early improvements. There can be competing health risks. That's great if you help them with malaria, but there's many other health risks that people have, and there's lots of other shocks. So will they be sustained? It's not clear. And there's also this idea about complementarity. If you have an improvement in early childhood health, you need to kind of keep working on this improvement so that it stays throughout their lifetime. So we've looked around, there's just not a lot of randomized studies looking at what I would call a positive health impact. There's been a fair amount of work looking at negative shocks. We've looked at famines, we've looked at wars, there's all these different negative shocks that's happened. But really there hasn't been a lot of work on these positive effects. And that's just because there's a lack of well-designed programs that took place 20 or more years ago. And the other thing specifically with this project that we were interested in, it's in Bangladesh, and there are high migration rates in Bangladesh for work. And in general, there's just increasing strategy in many countries to migrate for work and improve your labor market outcomes. But we actually know almost nothing on the effects of early childhood health on migration patterns. So we would like to kind of examine that in this paper by looking at the effect of early childhood health investments, particularly through a family planning and child health program, so it's going to be both combined. And we'll look 35 years later in an area of Bangladesh called MATLAB, and again, we'll focus on those economic and migration outcomes. There's a good number of them. I'm also going to look at the mechanisms, why we think this may have happened, and it's not going to be the best answer because they all could have come into play. And I have papers on men and women, so it's long. And I may not get to it all, but we can kind of do a choose your own adventure a little bit. If I'm skipping over something that you're like, actually, I'd really like to know that, slow me down and we'll go through it. And you may think, this is great, you're looking at economic and migration outcomes, but don't you want to look at human capital first? So I have a related paper on that. And there's just too much for one paper, so I'm choosing, this is to kind of focus on this paper because I think it's a little bit counterintuitive, some of it, and I'd really like to get people's input into that, but I'll let you know what happened on the human capital side as well. So what am I going to do just quickly is I'm going to take advantage of this really strong intervention. So this is family planning. There's a reduction of about 1 kid per family. and childhood vaccines. Now, these are arguably two of some of the most important health interventions in the last century.
So we're in economics, we're going to do the rules in here. Charlotte, slightly more.
Yes, please. Yeah, I was going to say, please. I'll get nervous if you don't. I'm an economist, so I'll get nervous if you don't interrupt me.
So what does it mean that there's an intervention that removes a child?
It's a family planning program, so they're just going to have less children. So if you hold out, I will go into exactly what we'll go into there. But I do want you to think about this as being bundled. So it is family planning and child health together, especially by the time we look 35 years later. And we're going to do a very simple strategy. There's a comparison group and a treatment group built into the design from the very beginning. So we can just do a simple difference in means, okay, with a bunch of controls if we want to, but we're going to compare treatment versus comparison group. And I'm going to look at two different cohorts. And particularly, I'm going to focus on a cohort who was born when there was just family planning. That was from 77 to 81. Again, I'll talk about the rollout in a minute. These people are 30 to 34, so they're full in their labor market outcomes right now. And we'll look at another cohort was born when there was family planning and child health, and they're 24 to 29. And again, we'll look at the single differences between treatment and comparison for both these different cohorts as we go through. And then we'll take advantage of a really rich set of data, including pre-programmed data. So before 1977, we have data. We've traced these people back to those data sets. They have individual identification numbers, so that's actually easier than it might sound. And we'll take a particularly advantage of a survey that took place between 2012 and 2015 to follow up a cohort. We put a lot of attention into migration and attrition. There's less than 10% attrition in this data set. I will also go over that and what this data is. And there's just basically a lot of demographic data. So we have great data both in our data set on migration and in the demographic surveillance site, and in particular on birth ages. So we're pretty confident about how old people are, because in many developing countries, people in their 20s and 30s may not know their age, but we have good data on that. So there are some related papers on this. Particular, what you might care about are what are the short-term effects of this program, right? If there aren't important short-term effects, why do we care? Well, one of the goals of the program was a measles vaccine, and measles was reduced by about 19%. And we also see, deaths attributed to measles about 57%. That's actually not a lot of the sample. What we find, what there also is a lot of reduction in malnutrition during this time period. And we find a reduction in migration out of the treatment area because it's a place-based program and people stayed for the program. In terms of medium-term effects, for women 25 to 55, there's about one less child. That was corroborated in a number of different studies. If you want to look at the human capital side of this idea of having early childhood health, a lot of vaccines, it led to, and we look at when these kids were 8 to 14, there was about a 0.2 standard deviation increase in height and education, and about a 0.2 standard deviation increase in cognition as measured by the mini mental state exam. So long-term wise, if we just look at these human capital effects, did those kind of stay? There's similar height effects. They're still taller, which is great. One would worry if they weren't. Education effect is still higher for men. It's not for women. There was a women's education project at the same time, so in Bangladesh. So we don't see a big difference in education among women, but there appeared to be kind of catch up in cognition. So cognition for when these people are adults, this is the exact same sample I'll be looking at the economic outcomes on. These are their human capital outcomes. There's been catch up. So there doesn't appear to be, on many different measures, a difference in cognition now.
So to be clear on the education, women's education was going up a lot, but it was going up in both groups.
That's right. They really Bangladesh targeted women's education. There was a secondary stipend program. There is incentives for primary. So we're just not seeing a difference for them, but we are for men.
I mean, and this is the stuff Jane Mencken was talking about for years, but the whole program itself sort of led to an enormous rise in female well-being just because of all of the work that was being placed into these places, treatment and control alike. Right? You guys
Yeah,
have seen that?
we haven't seen so much of that.
Yeah, I mean, this was
So-
going back into the last.
Yeah, so, and we haven't, this particular group I'm not looking at that for right now, but we're not seeing it so much for the adults who would have benefited mainly from the family planning.
Right,
But we're still looking into that. That's right. Earlier it did, but it's kind of faded out.
Gotcha.
So we're seeing some fade out in some of those effects.
Is the science human capital useful for earnings? Do you have information on earnings? Because it's nice to be more highly educated.
This is what I'm going to talk about today. So those are all other papers, and I will focus on all those labor market outcomes and migration, mainly, and some other economic outcomes like assets and loans. Just in terms of related papers, oops, that's not. Oh, sorry. I'll talk about quickly the contributions. So really, this is one of the few programs where we've been able to look at the long-run effects of kind of a treatment and comparison. This is not randomized. It's quasi-experimental. Kind of many years later when these people are adults. And we'll take a look at some of the related papers just quickly. One of the other real benefits is that we are able to look at earnings well, and because we have such low attrition rates. And so we don't suffer from all those biases that most of the other studies do. They have up to 40% attrition when they're looking at long run effects. So that's just, we'll see, just doesn't really work that well, at least in our setting. And we really benefit from a lot of rich data, which you will see in a minute. So what is this program that I'm talking about? Here's a map of MATLAB. And what we have is a treatment and comparison area. The green is treatment. The yellow, it always comes up as a different color, but this is great. The yellow is comparison. And this program started in 1977. It started actually as a pilot for the government family planning program. And they chose this area because there's John Hopkins has worked in this area to do some cholera studies, so they had a lot of other information from the demographic surveillance site. And what's nice about it is these areas, as you see, it's not random, they're contiguous. But if you try to do vaccinations or family planning and you randomize at the individual level, the spillovers would be too large. So doing this at an individual level is just not possible. And for practical reasons, they wanted to make it contiguous. And you'll see this is a pretty homogeneous area. And on purpose, that they weren't that worried about differences between the two areas. And I will show you, in fact, they look extremely similar. But they had to have health centers that people could go to, so they wanted to make that geographic. One thing that's important to realize for economic outcomes, there is a main town. It's rural, but it's not that rural. Bangladesh, there's people everywhere, so don't think Malawi, okay? It's pretty busy. But the main town is in the treatment area, and I'm gonna worry about that, and I'll show you some robustness checks to say that I don't think this is just some local average treatment effect that's going on, and that's kind of localized to the treatment area, and we don't have the same kind of market, but these people migrate, they migrate internationally, 60% migrate, so really they can move around the study site. We've looked at prices are pretty even across it, so I don't think there's some kind of local labor market effect going on there. So that's kind of what it looks like. So what happened, started in 1977 in October, and that's when they kind of focused on the moms, and they brought in family planning and Texas toxoid shots. 5 years later, they brought in measles. Actually, they brought measles into half the treatment area first and then rolled that out, but unfortunately there's not always enough sample size to break it down by that. These interventions were provided in the home. They would kind of come monthly and just provide the interventions, check on the women. A lot of it was injections, so it's kind of old style rather than pills that are used now. And they did this in the home. Partly this is a Muslim population, so there's some limitations to how much these women can leave their house. Then in 1986, they brought in the rest of the main epi vaccines. These were brought in before they had actually expanded throughout the country. Again, UNICEF was kind of working with them. They were testing how to roll this out properly. And they also did a little bit of vitamin A and nutrition intervention. By 1989, UNICEF was working to roll out vaccines across the whole country. So now the comparison group has vaccines. Finally, there's a couple surveys. There's one that you might all know that's public, which is, we call it MHSS1, which is the MATLAB Health and Socioeconomic Survey. That's where we got our adolescent information from for the earlier data. We came back finishing in 2015 and have done a follow-up of that sample plus that's much wider. And so what's the oops, sorry. What we're going to do here is take a look using the MHSS2 data, and we're going to, sorry, this was supposed to be for, and look at two age groups. One is the 30 to 34-year-old, born during family planning time. The next is the 24 to 29-year-olds. Those are going to be born when the child has vaccines come through. Okay, we're going to focus on those cohorts. What did take-up look like? Really strong. The green is measles vaccine. We hit 1982, it goes up to 60% and keeps going. There is no kind of vaccination possible in the comparison area at this time. There is no data, which is why I don't have the comparison group on there. If we look at family planning, it's a little bit different because it was available in government health clinics, but not at your doorstep. So what you see is when the program comes along, there's a jump up to about 30% use, and it keeps going up, but it also keeps going up in the comparison area. Okay, so it's not like there's nothing in the comparison area. It's just more intense delivery in the treatment area. So it's a pretty strong take-up design. So I'm going to skip over some of the mechanisms because I think I just have an hour.
So what you're assuming is that this program illuminated these women?
Illuminated?
Yeah, illuminated them into the beauty of child or birth control.
That's right. They would come and they would talk. So they would come into the household and they would have an array of interventions with them. And then they had sub-centers, which some of these injections have side effects and they didn't want the women to be afraid of that. So there would be sub-centers where these women could go to get help. And they would refer them to a sub-center, and then there was a main hospital. So ICDRB, who was running this program, kind of set that all up. And when they would come to their household kind of regularly, they'd check on how things were going, and then they would vaccinate children or give vitamin A. The nutrition was more rehabilitation, so that there was an issue.
Understand the program. So they went in 77.
Mm-hmm.
They gave them the contraceptive shot, and they gave them the address of a healthcare center. And did they keep recruiting people throughout the time, or that was it just at 77?
This is they would go monthly. So these households, it's actually pretty important to know this. This is a demographic surveillance site. And so both treatment and comparison area, they would go monthly to every 3 months to collect data on birth, migration, deaths. So people were always in the household and treatment and comparison areas. And then here, for the kind of what we might call doorstep fertility, they would go monthly again and just kind of offer these, what was needed, check up on them, make sure there are no issues.
So what is the difference between the two then? Is the shot or is it something else?
What's the difference between the treatment and comparison?
Yeah.
The treatment was the only one. Sure. So for family planning, the family planning happened they would come once a month and to your doorstep. In the comparison area, they'd need to go to a local subcenter clinic. So they'd have to leave their house and go to the subcenter clinic to do that, which is actually fairly difficult for a Muslim woman in the 70s.
And that lasted until 384.
So after, I'm kind of showing you, kind of in the 90s, they then entered, this is a pilot for the government program. By the 90s, they began to do more intensive doorstep to fertility to the comparison area. Okay, still not quite as intense, but they started to go door to door as well. Did that answer your question? Great. Any other questions on the setup?
So the difference between the treatment and the control group prior to the intervention, should we be concerned about the prior trend?
We could be, and we can do some double different stuff too, but it's actually not significantly different. Those are actually pretty close. And I'll bring in what's beautiful about this area is there's a wealth of data. So we bring in a lot of controls at different points to look at baseline differences. Any other questions here on the setup? What we're looking at? Great. So just super briefly on mechanisms, what are we thinking about? This is a child health intervention. It's vaccines. I think the main point I want to bring over, while it may reduce death somewhat, what it really does is improves people's nutrition. They used to be kind of sick for many periods with one disease after the next. That is no longer the case. So in the medium term, what you might think about is that improves your human capital, including cognition, which we saw, and education levels, which we saw. When we think about family planning, it's kind of what you got to also think about is you have fewer siblings, and you might be higher birth order. right? So it's like this combination now that it's going to affect their economic and migration outcomes. How do we feel like this might affect migration? People have thought a little bit less about this, and some of our results are counterintuitive. A lot of people think you increase human capital, migration should increase, right? But in fact, that's one set of stories that we know, but we also know that they may migrate less because there's actually uncertainty over those expected returns for this population. So they don't know if they're going to get their better jobs. They can get their better jobs at home, but will they get their better jobs when they migrate? And it's also kind of an ambiguous effect on duration of migration. And part of that is because people act somewhat like, there's many different theories, but one theory is they act like target savers. They get the amount of money they need, they come back. So if you are actually making more because you're higher educated, you're going to come back earlier. You also have a preference often for consuming with friends and family. So again, you might come back earlier.
So in this area, what do people actually do? Are these mainly farmers?
No. So it's 60% migration from this period we'll get to, and where they are either migrating to urban areas, and a lot of it's construction, rickshaw driver, so very physical work, or it's to the Gulf. And again, they're the people who you see on building those high rises. So, and at home, it's there's still schools, there's still lots of small business. So a lot of people have opened small businesses, and we'll see that. If we think about how family size might affect migration, there's positive and negatives, right? So if you have a smaller family size, do you need someone to stay home to help the family? Does someone have to take care of the family farm, or you lose the land? So that might mean that you're more likely to have to stay because there's one less kid. On the opposite side, your parents have more resources because there's less kids, so you don't have to, or you might need to diversify your income, so you may be more likely to stay. So there's really kind of an ambiguous effect on migration that I think a lot of people just think it should be just kind of positive. Yep.
Could you comment just briefly on gender roles too? Like, do women move away from marriage? Do they tend to stay in their local neighborhood? Can they be involved in farming?
Sure. So women do move for marriage, and that's what their main migration is. Women do not migrate internationally. They may move to rural areas, so migration internationally is solo migration, and it tends to be circular migration, and they have to come back. Okay, they cannot live in Bahrain, and they'll never be citizens, so they tend to come back. And so women, they will look at some of their work information. They work mainly in agriculture, and there may be some small business, but that's one area where there's less ability to have an impact because they're more restricted. It'd be great to kind of incentivize some of these women to spread out what they do. So what are the data sources we're going to use? First, I want you to think about this as it's a very large socioeconomic survey. Maybe you want to think about the Indonesia Family Life Survey, but it's extremely large. And we based it off the 1996 survey, and what they did was take a representative sample of the study area, treatment and control, and they did it at what we call the Bari level, which is a compound of households. And so that's randomized. It looks like the study area in 1996, but that's not what we want. We want a representative of the study area in 74. So we took that sample, and they randomized which household within the Bari they would take, okay? But we want more than that. What we're worried about are people who might have migrated out between when the program started in 77 and the 96 survey, and this is where the demographic surveillance data comes in handy. We know who those people are because they went around every month and found out who left households. So, and they all have an ID. So we also followed people who moved out of those households between 77 and 96. So what we're kind of missing, if full households go missing, we don't have those. So we actually have a kind of a sample of households also that went missing. So we did our best to make it look more like before pre-77 than this 96 survey. So it's a lot of the same sample with some extras, okay, to try and deal with that. And most importantly, we did extensive tracking. Overall, the attrition rate from our sample is less than 8%. And just to talk a little bit, which is super important, talk up a little bit about how that happened. The dark green here is if we didn't kind of try to follow migrants at all. And you'd see with males, we would have gotten kind of 55%, females 65%, which is kind of what you see in other studies with high migration rates. So we went and did what we call rapid response, and we went back to the original households and had them contact the migrants. We had people in different areas. So if they were in Bangladesh, in Dhaka or in Chittagong or other main cities, they were talking and going right to try and find those migrants. That helped. I bumped up things by 13 or 17%. But again, 65%, that's not great. Who migrates, typically, even though we'll see our results, typically it's people who are doing a little better. So we did a lot of Eid interviews. People do come back both internationally and from faraway areas to the local town to celebrate Eid. So we interviewed really intensely over a number of Eids. Again, another 8%, that's great. It's still not enough. We're still not at 80. So we sat down and decided we need to do a phone interview. There's no other way to do this. These people are international. A full 25% of our sample of men are international. And it worked spectacularly well because they're lonely, and how nice to have this female Bangladeshi voice phone. And that really helped, and now we're kind of above 90%. Now that does mean our phone survey, one thing I regret is that I didn't push to do it longer. Everybody was worried about the phone survey, and they would have loved to have talked for hours, but it doesn't tend to affect our migration or our economic outcomes because we asked about those. It's more things like cognition that are hard to measure over the phone. So it shouldn't affect us too much in this paper, but that's kind of how we got to where we got to with our low attrition rates. I'm not going to go too much into other data sources, but I have census data from '74, so I have some baseline data. And then I have some of these demographic surveillance data, which we particularly use to also look at kind of ever migration issues. Most important is, well, that's great. How do you get your treatment status? We can't take it from where you lived in 1996 because that's endogenous. You might have moved into the area. So what we do, because people tend to stay in the male patriarchal system and stay in the male's household, we follow households. We link people to their household head. We use this demographic surveillance data where we can track whatever household they've been in for years. And we either follow them back, these people were born after that, or we follow their household head back to '74. And treatment status is based on where you or your household head lived in 1974. So how similar do these places look? They look actually pretty similar. What we have over here is your balance on treatment and control. And there's two main things that aren't balanced. This is all data from the 1974 census of the study area, not of Bangladesh, just the study area. There's two things that we're mainly concerned about that aren't balanced. And one is that there tends to be slightly less Muslim population, by 11%. There's also a Hindu population. A lot of the Hindus left when there was kind of partition in the early 70s. So there's slightly less Hindus, less Muslims there. We can do a robustness check only looking at the Muslim population, and the results remain the same. And there's more tube well waters. And so what was happening was there was a program again with UNICEF to expand tube well water throughout this region, which is great. That brings cleaner water. But as many of you might know, Southeast Asia, arsenic is endemic. It brought more arsenic. And why it's imbalanced here, they were just beginning to roll out the program, so over time that imbalance is going to go down. But it's something we kind of worry about. We worry about a little bit more for cognition. When you do interactions with access to tube well water, and we've also collected more arsenic data, we're not finding results change all that much. But it's just something to be aware of. If we look at attrition and balance, we're not expect to find a whole lot because we looked pretty hard at this. You do find a little bit of a difference by birth year. That's partly because to save money, we really followed the people who were born during the study period but not born before it. So that's why there's a little bit of imbalance on age, and there's this kind of random imbalance on walls or owning a radio. So looks pretty good. Again, here's an equation for those who think of equations. This is a very simple equation. What are we doing? We are looking at two different age groups, 24 to 29 or 30 to 34, and we're just going to do a single difference. We'll just do a single difference here, treatment versus control for the 24 to 29, and then treatment versus control for the 30 to 34-year-olds. We're going to put birth year fixed effects. That can make a difference. We control here for all the baseline census data, so that's what you just saw on the previous sheet that I moved through, so we'll have all those controls. And then we have a pile of extended controls, including introduction of microcredit, flood controls, controls for education supply, arsenic, health supply. I think we have transportation now. Again, I'm not going to show you all the extended controls, but results don't change for this at all. Kind of trying to include as much as we can, thinking about what has changed potentially over this 35 years. All our standard errors are clustered at the treatment village level.
So how much of a surprise was that treatment? Or can you exclude the fact that people might have migrated because they anticipated in some areas that treatment will occur and not in others?
Yeah, there wasn't much migration at that point in time because there's no sale of land, and it was more agricultural then. So I think what you might worry most about is women who move into the area because of the program. And so that's where I'd worry about our treatment variable. But our treatment variable is based on where you lived in 1974, and definitely in 1974, because that's when we had the census data, they did not know about this program coming up. So hopefully we've dealt with it by tracing back to there. So we'll start with the men's results. All these are all intent to treat results. And the third thing I would like to point out is these men work. They work a little bit less for 24 to 29. Some of them are still in school, about 10% actually, which is kind of adds up, are still in school. There's a slightly more likelihood to be to have university education amongst this group. So given that everybody works, there's not much of a treatment effect. So what we'd like to know though, that's great, do they change their type of work? And they do. So we have job categories, and we categorize them into being kind of what's professional. So we're talking about doctors, business managers, educators, or semi-professional, kind of owning a business, having some employees. And we find actually there's 8 percentage points or 25% increase. So up here, I'm always going to put the percentage point increases if it's a 0, 1, and I'll change it into a percentage change here. And the means of the variables are down below, so you can kind of choose what to look at. Maybe it's easiest to look at percentage change because the means often are quite different between the two groups. But what we're seeing is basically a 25% increase and you working in a better job, which is great. That's kind of what we'd like to see, which is nice. It's not what we find in my Nicaragua work, but it was great to find this here. But for those, and this is a group had child health and family planning. If we look at the group board just when there's family planning, there's basically not a lot of change in their type of professional work. We see this huge increase in ag work, but really few of these people, their main job is ag. So this is your primary job. It doesn't change if we include secondary jobs as well. Okay, and what we're seeing also is a reduction in manual labor. Okay, so that could be a rickshaw puller, for instance, and that's by about 13%. So this is kind of nice. They tend to be doing what we might think of as kind of better jobs, but
It said that of the two sets of victims, or whatever word is the right one of the intervention, there was the early one, nothing happened.
that's right. Those just born were in family planning, so they didn't have any of the human capital. Those who benefited from better human capital, they are.
Was the measles vaccine? What else?
There was measles. I could go back. Measles, BCG, vitamin A. So your main epi vaccines. And so what you have to realize with those vaccines, people, if you're not really into vaccines, it's a massive health hit. I mean, this was a malnourished population back in the 70s and so what you want to think about that, yes, and I've looked for mortality selection. There's not mortality selection. In the end, not that many people die, but what happened is they were a lot less sick. So in a malnourished population, when you're sick for a year or more, pertussis can go on for a while. You'll end up with poor nutrition. So think about it more as a nutrition shock. Does that help? Okay. So that's great, but what we'd like to see is how that works out in skills. So we asked about required skills. They were more likely, 34% more likely to have to use reading, writing, or math in their job, and less likely, about 6%, to have to use physical skills. That's not significant. Okay? So it looks like how often people think about better jobs, this is what they have. In addition, what we're finding is they're more likely to be self-employed, 44%, and to start their own businesses. So there's some kind of entrepreneurial spirit going on here, that they're making their businesses, they're using their reading, writing, and math. Now, these semi-professional jobs, just a little bit of a robustness check here, they include small shops. This is kind of these entrepreneurial, but some of these are tea stalls, right? You might argue that maybe that's not a better job. I'm not sure, but in case you are, let's kind of take a look at that. So we're going to remove all our small shops, and we go from kind of 8 percentage point increase to a 6 percentage point increase. And then we'll only look at jobs that were really classified as professional. And again, our means are going down here, right? Now we're at 9% of this population that has what you would call a professional job. Still significant, there's still a 6 percentage point increase. You may also think that this effect on jobs just comes from your father, right? We have earlier work that showed that people stayed in the area, and maybe they're the ones, the dads are the ones who, they stayed, they had to figure out how to stay, so they had some kind of better job. But it doesn't, their dads don't have more professional jobs in 1996. So it doesn't look like it's just coming from their dad.
So I'm sorry to go back on this, but
Yep.
so the difference between these two, one's a 6-year and one's a 5-year cohort, is that the 30 to 34-year-olds, their mothers got
Family planning.
family planning, and the 24 to 29 years olds got, their mothers got family planning, and they, the children, got the vaccine.
Right, and these guys had younger brothers or sisters, often, who also got the vaccines. So there's some kind of, there's sibling effects that are going on here. It takes a while to wrap your head around it, so keep slowing it down and asking those questions.
So I mean, just at this point, the point is that it's, well, okay, you'll go on about this, but I mean, since some of these people are related, it's the family planning effect could show up for the others.
That's right. It's absolutely a combination of smaller family size. For this group, it's absolutely a combination of smaller family size and better human capital. And for this group, there's smaller family sizes. Okay, it's not just, this is not just a child health, it's also a family planning effect in here.
So how many cases would be from the same families?
You know what, I should know that and I don't, but it's pretty high. Okay. And we're going to do a little bit of, if you have a younger sibling, analysis in a little bit, so you'll at least see what some of those effects are, but I should know that and I don't, so thank you.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about how much of the economy are you controlling for, specifically because there is creating a regional pattern in how those economics have changed it, not just like
right.
GDP, but sort of like the composition. And
right. So right now, this is a pretty small area, and people can migrate all around it. So we're just about to get, so I'm not too worried that there's some kind of local labor market effect. Right now, I'm just controlling for baseline characteristics. And as extended controls, you know, we change for health supply in the village, school supply, and we're assuming that you can migrate around, so we haven't controlled for businesses, because it's all endogenous, right? Because they're starting their own businesses. Okay, but I'm not worried about that, and I'll do some more analysis we'll get to try, and hopefully you'll feel better about that aspect, to make it a little even more similar on that.
I missed your point already, but did everyone in control area actually get vaccine? Or some of it?
No one in the control area, so those vaccines have to be given, they're under age 5, they're usually given?
Treatment group, yeah.
Did they all take it up?
Yeah, every household get actual vaccine?
They were all invited to, right? And so the first year there's a 60% take up, and it got to 80% take up
so
by the end of this period.
Non-compliant, basically.
There is some non-compliance, yeah, but not a lot. And then there's herd immunity. So even, so more than this 60% the first year, and then it just kind of went exponentially up. Well, not exponentially, it's put steadily up. So the next question, yeah? I do. And in my earlier paper, I do a treatment on the treated analysis, and the impact goes up a lot. But truly, that's not it's not a good instrument. I can't just say, you know, the treatment affects so many different aspects of these people's lives that I can't justify what I need to for using it as an IV. So that's why I don't do it, but I can, I have that. In my earlier paper, I felt more comfortable with it, but this paper, I don't. So the next question is, that's great. They seem to have these better jobs. Do they make any more? Well, you know what? They're not making any more. And in fact, the 30 to 34-year-olds are making, these are US dollars, significantly less. Okay? So these are kind of your mean US dollars. One thing to point out, the 30 to 34-year-olds make more, they are older, they are more established. These guys really are at the beginning of their earnings trajectory. And this isn't coming because of hours. So what?
Is this annual?
These are annual, yeah.
This is $500, close to $500 they're making this?
Yes, it's huge.
That's,
It's 23% reduction, right? This is worrisome. It's worrisome that these guys have better jobs, and why aren't they making more, and these guys are making less. But this was our big puzzle. And there's massive difference in current migration rates. So if we look at current migration, and we look at all migration, the 20 to 24-year-olds are much more likely to stay home, 20% more likely to stay in MATLAB. Our 30 to 34-year-olds, 17%, but it differs where. Our 20 to 24-year-olds are less likely to migrate to urban areas. Chittagong, Dhaka, rickshaw pulling, they're not doing it. They're staying home and they're making little businesses, okay? They're doing their entrepreneurial work. And so they're 28% less likely to migrate to urban areas. They're just as likely, though, to migrate to international areas. That's where the big money is, okay? They go to the Gulf and they make a lot of money. But they've managed to migrate less to urban areas, but make just the same. So if you think migration costs are high, which a lot of studies show that migration costs are pretty high to these people, not just the cost of going, that's not that much. It's the cost that you don't be with your family, you're away, all of that, then actually they're doing better. But what's different with the 30 to 34-year-olds, they're less likely, 37% less likely to migrate to international areas. And there you lose a lot of money. Okay? So these results are highly correlated with this pattern of reductions in migration. And we're going to look a little bit, the question is, why are they less likely to migrate to international areas? And I'll show you in a little bit one theory. And I'd love to hear other theories that you might have, but it's this family planning program and having less children that we think is driving it.
Related to whom you know, I think migration is very correlated with the
Absolutely. So we have all your So we will look at the migration networks in just a little bit. And we have all their migration network information, both pre-program and current, because we know who they live with. We can follow everything in the demographic surveillance data.
so is it well accepted who in the world is supposed to take care of your parents?
It's not totally well accepted, but I've looked also at birth order.
One good conditional birth order, Steve, for those that are not supposed to take care of the parents, whether the effects ought to be smaller.
That's right.
Because one theory is that you have a smaller number of siblings. So yeah, one has to
Somebody has to stay home. Exactly.
Where the cost is coming from.
That's right. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of that in a second. I found out more about number of younger siblings rather than birth order, but they're related, so it's hard to tell the difference. But just to give you an idea, totally endogenous, but everyone says, well, what if you split by migration status? How do things look, right? Because the 20 to 24-year-olds, they're supposed to have these better jobs, and if we look, they have better jobs as migrants, and they have better jobs as non-migrants. There's just more of them who don't migrate, okay? So yes, it's total selection. If it's selection that's driving this, they're managing to select themselves so they get a better job no matter where they go. If you look at earnings, they make more in both places. They make 200 more if they're non-migrants. Again, there's selection into that, but it's consistent with the story of better jobs and higher education and them choosing where they're going to make the most. And on average, they make the same. That is not the case as much with the 30 to 34-year-olds. And kind of hours worked, again, they're working more hours here. And here they're kind of working less hours. So endogenous, take it with a grain of salt. But it seems like conditional on migration, especially these 20, 24-year-olds are doing better in both places. It's just you make less on average when you stay in MATLAB and they're not migrating. So on average, they make the same.
Another question. One thing that's strange to me.
Yes.
You are comparing the two greens, those guys wearing one blue, wearing three downs, that was the thing, and the other. Isn't the more natural thing to look at those two rows? Because there you can really see that the guys who the younger group got the vaccines and the other ones didn't. And if you forget completely at the groups of the treatment effect,
So I can do that.
then the differences are much, much larger.
That's right. So you have to decide what you're trying to control for. So I could decide to control for think about this as a comparison for the control for the family planning program.
Well,
But it's not perfect.
depends what you want to talk about.
It does. It does. So
You know who's sibling of whom.
yes,
Shouldn't that be
I can do that.
the true measure of value added of the vaccine?
It's just family size is endogenous, so it becomes endogenous doing that. But certainly if I did that, you were absolutely right, and maybe what I'm hearing is it would be of interest to do that even within this paper. We could have another line saying what's the difference between the two.
What I'm seeing this is that the two areas are different.
Which two areas are different?
The ones that got the treatment and the ones that didn't.
Why are you seeing that they're different? Because we looked at their baseline characteristics and they were actually almost on top of each other.
Well,
There's no one for being homogeneous, it's close.
who are positive intervention, yet that group did worse. So we can see, maybe I'm reading it badly.
No, you look at that. For this, and so the question is why? So let's hold that up. They have smaller family sizes. Someone has to stay home. They're not migrating internationally. And we'll take a look in a second to see if that's affected by who your younger siblings are. Give me 1 sec. In fact, maybe I'll just skip to that right now. I'm going to wait, but hold out because I'm going to show you something on that.
Are these just men? Or you have men?
These are just men right now. Yeah.
Are the returns to migration higher for the treatment group? Because presumably if there are returns to both physical health and cognitive health, right, then those in the treatment group ought to do better conditional on migrating.
So conditionally on migrating, they were earning more.
Okay.
That's what that last one just said, absolutely. Right? Conditionally on migrating, they are earning about $100 more. They earn a lot more. The non-migrants earn a lot more. Yeah. If I don't split it, yes. All the standard migration stuff holds. Just to understand, what's the difference driving this current migration? What we're seeing if we look at duration of migration in the past 5 years, their durations are shorter by 0.2 to 0.3 of a year. So they are coming back earlier. They're also more likely to not migrate at all. What we're not finding is a difference in the age of migration. So they're migrating at the same age, they're coming back a little earlier, or they're choosing to not migrate in the first place. Okay, so that seems to be what's driving that result. Just super quickly, these aren't as interesting. We looked at other economic outcomes. There's not a whole lot of effects here. Household consumption is about the same, assets is about the same, no difference in lands. Loans, similar to whether they're starting more businesses, they have more business loans, that's consistent. I was not allowed to collect savings information, so I don't have information on savings, which I've still regretted. But let's go back to this question of why is this group 3 making less money? Why are they less likely to migrate internationally? And so what we look at is how many younger siblings do you have? Sorry, I just called them the 30 to 34-year-olds. Sometimes I call them group 3 to make it short of the 30 to 34-year-olds. Let's look at how many of them have a younger sibling born during the family planning program, during the child health program. So
Before that, if you were to do a back of the envelope calculation, you know how long they stay abroad, you know how much less they make. So what do moving costs would have to be in order to rationalize the behavior, right? Because on one hand you make less because there's a lower incidence of moving away. On the other hand, it's costly to move.
So for these guys, I don't think they're making $500 a year less. I don't think it's to their benefit. We're actually getting all that cost information on another survey right now because we're looking more into this. But I could do that.
Just to get a sense of, migration is a choice. And
that's right.
The treatment group.
That would be, we should add that to that thought process. But what you're seeing here, just 1 second, what you're seeing here, there's still learning aspect. we've got small sample sizes by the time we're just looking at the 30 to 34-year-olds. And if you have 2 or more siblings that were born after this period, and I think these are just men, sorry, that should say that, they certainly make a whole lot less. Noisy, they're also a lot less likely to migrate internationally. So this is not great support because it's not significant, but some support for the fact that someone needs to stay, and they're the ones who end up having to stay. And that used to be more the older sibling would migrate internationally, but it depends a little bit on their age because international migration is growing over this period of time.
So it isn't the older sibling who would stay, but taking care of the parents, or would have the right to take over the farm?
So the way it works in Muslim culture is the land is split evenly between, supposed to be all the men, also all the sons, and they're supposed to get twice as much as the daughters, but often the daughters, reality the daughters don't get anything, so it's split. So it's not like the Hindus where it all goes to the oldest male. Okay, so, is this a change for the older? You can't really discern between birth order effects and the fact that these younger siblings had better health. But it could be that there's some choosing the winners of who to send abroad, like let's send the more educated, the one who seems to be a little smarter abroad, or it could just be a change in birth order effects. Okay? So somebody seems to have to stay, and it looks like it's these older siblings. I did a lot of heterogeneity. I'm not going to get into it too much because we're in mechanisms, because I want to at least look at the girls. But basically, we'll look at 6 potential mechanisms, which includes networks, which you were asking about. Okay, and there are positive effects on family planning if we look at number of older male siblings. We look at human capital. We've talked about it. We look at migration networks. Fathers migrated. The program affects all of these things in the way that's consistent with how the results go, okay? So that's great, but not particularly helpful when you're trying to figure out the mechanism, right? That's great, it affects everything. So we're gonna take these various outcomes and we're gonna put them on the right-hand side to see if any of them kind of diminish the treatment effect. And then again, kind of just quickly, what do we find? Well, for professional jobs, if you control for education, it reduces the effect by about 25%. So that's some evidence to say that education is affecting type of jobs. If we look at earnings, you control for migration. Now there's a positive effect of earnings for the 24 to 25-year-olds. It's not significant, but again, control for migration, it becomes positive. It's kind of in what we might think. If we control for international migration for the 30 to 34-year-olds, there's a 1/3 reduction. Okay, if we look at international migration, there's in control for all our mechanisms, there's a 1/3 reduction in the effect on international migration. So all of these things, younger siblings, the human capital, all of that seems to be affecting this international migration. If we look at heterogeneity with baseline characteristics, again, we have migrant networks on that. Definitely the effect is attenuated on migration, both for the 30 to 34-year-old cohort, if we control for or look at heterogeneity with migrant networks, with people coming from larger migration networks kind of more likely to migrate, just like you might think. So it is working in that way, for sure, but families were less likely to migrate because of or parents were less likely to migrate because of this program to begin with. Great, so just super quickly, I'm skipping all my robustness checks. There are lots of them. Let's just go to the woman quickly and go through stuff. To look at women's economic outcomes, you have to understand fertility, right? All of you know they're kind of linked. There are no differences in marriage. There's no difference really in age of marriage, though, some of this is, 0.4 of a year is a little bit. There's no difference in number of children. I have actually added basically the moms in this group. As expected, they had less children. That's what the family planning program was supposed to do. This is the result of other papers. There's reduced number of kids. And there's no difference in the age of first child, maybe a little bit younger. So there doesn't seem to be, for our 24 to 29-year-old woman or 30 to 34-year-old woman, much on the fertility side that's driving their economic outcomes. So let's go take a look at that. First, if we look at working, less than 30% work for pay. Okay? If we look in type of work, most of this work is in agricultural work. And a lot of this is small animal raising. You see lots of ducks and hens, okay? So they're more likely to be working in ag, a little less likely to be just pure housewives. Okay, that makes some sense. If we decompose this ag result here, we look at what type of ag work. They're working with small animals. Okay, so that's what women are doing, and they're more likely, 50% more likely to be working in small animal raising. However, this is not leading to, if we look at the full sample again, only 30% work. To be not endogenous, we don't want to control for the fact that you work. Truly, there's not enough people working to get good results from that. Conditional on working, they're working a little bit more. The average of what they make isn't all that big. If instead we use the rank, so instead of looking at amount you earn, you rank you from highest to lowest, first highest wage, second highest wage. There are effects on rank that we've just run that we'll bring into this that are kind of telling, which help us deal with the fact that wages are small anyway and they're noisy. Again, they're working actually a little bit more, which is consistent with this. And my migration rates are around, are high for most countries, not so high for men. Most of that migration is none is international, most of it's to urban areas, a little bit of rural, and there's not a lot going on.
Marry between the shade of green?
Sorry?
Do these women marry within the shade of green, or do they move out? Who are their husbands?
They tend to be local people. Yep, because some of them are, kind of married at birth almost. Yeah, they're not rushing to the city to go get married to someone. Yeah, okay. So what we do have information on is this is their own assets. So this is kind of a little bit more women's empowerment. These 24 to 29-year-old women, they have more cash savings, and they're more likely to take out a microcredit loan. So what this is kind of saying is they're engaging in small household agricultural businesses. Okay, they don't bring in a lot of money, but they're getting more into that. I'd like to see more going on, but that's where they are at. I am not going to recap, and we'll just kind of go to discussions. So what we see for these men is that there are important effects on the type of job for those who benefited from the child health interventions. But I want you to remember that they're pretty early in their career. Okay, and we saw that there was a big jump in even wages for those who were the older cohort. They're choosing to stay. There may be some trade-off between let me get more kind of human capital from working a better job now, and then maybe they'll try and move to urban areas later or try and improve their wages later. So maybe that's why on average they're the same. But there's also kind of a horse race. The comparison group is more likely to be in urban areas where an average wages are higher. Maybe they're trying to kind of save that and they'll come back and make some kind of investment later on. There's something to be learned about this reduction in migration for both cohorts. First of all, this was a place-based program. It reduced migration, obviously, and it's also reduced the cost of migration. So particularly those urban areas, international areas, there's a lot of cost, but those urban areas are also very costly for these folks. So we might think that the cost for the 20 to 24-year-olds, right, they didn't make it on average any more money, but their costs are clearly reduced from migration. So on average, they're probably better off. There was this, what we might think of a pretty unintended effect for the 30 to 34-year-olds. We were surprised. It's taken us a lot longer to kind of think about that, right? The mechanism's a little bit unclear, but it does look like it's kind of being driven by smaller family sizes, right? Someone has to stay, their younger brothers or sisters are going, they're the ones who are staying for that, right? What will that do long term? Could that be better for them? They have not migrated internationally. There's a lot of work now being done that those jobs are not great, they're dangerous. You haven't got the same relationship with your wife because you're not there, you're gone for years, so maybe long term there's some benefits from having stayed, but clearly there's a big negative on your income. So we'll have to see what time tells on that effect. It'll be important to go and check that out. And importantly, we saw that migration affected their wages, right? And so there's all these studies being done of long-term effects, and people are not following the migrants, or it's really hard. So I really want to push that, we have to make a concerted effort. Work and migration go together now. That's how people make a lot of their money, that we really need to reduce attrition in these studies to be able to do this properly. And sample sizes matter. earnings is noisy, so you can kind of randomize who you choose, but you better be careful because earnings are noisy, and then you still don't know the effect of your results.
Hey, I did it. Tanya, thanks.
I did it.